Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're going to be looking at something a little bit different.
Yeah.
An excerpt from an article called "On Resistance to Evil by Force," and
Right.
it's a really interesting piece because it really kind of grapples with this question of how should people,
Hmm.
particularly people of faith, respond to what they see as a society that's increasingly kind of riddled with evil.
Hmm.
And
And the author's not pulling any punches.
no,
They really see modern society as deeply flawed.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
and they point to things like abortion and what they call the decline of traditional values as evidence of this kind of
Yeah.
widespread evil.
Yeah, it's interesting too because they don't just critique society as a whole, right? There's almost like a second layer to the argument.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're also deeply concerned about what they see as the negative influence of secularism on Christianity itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so it's almost like they're worried that the secular ideas have seeped into the church
Yeah.
and led to a decline in what they consider true Christian values.
So they're not just saying like the world's going downhill. They're saying like the very institution that's meant to
Right.
provide moral guidance is also being
corrupted.
corrupted. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're very specific about what that corruption looks like.
Yeah.
One of the things that they do is they draw this distinction between what they call external evil.
Mm.
So, think wars, famines, things that humanity has always struggled with,
Right. Classic.
and what they consider
Good.
a new internal evil that's taken root within the Christian community. Now, let's pause there for a second because I think this idea of internal evil needs a bit more unpacking.
Yeah.
Because when they use that phrase, what they're really talking about is things like
Mhm.
hypocrisy within the church.
Yeah.
People saying they follow Christian principles but not actually living by them or watering down core beliefs to fit in with modern trends. So I'm curious, listener, does this idea of internal evil within a community resonate with you?
Yeah.
What examples come to mind, maybe even beyond just the religious context?
It's a fascinating concept.
Yeah.
Because it really forces you to look inward as much as outward.
Hmm.
Now, the author then takes a pretty bold step and uses the death penalty as an example of what they consider justified violence,
Ooh, well, yeah.
which is sure to spark some
That's a hot button issue, for sure.
strong opinions.
Yeah. This is where things get really complex because their argument hinges on this belief that some crimes are so horrific,
Mhm.
so fundamentally destructive that traditional forms of rehabilitation just won't cut it.
Right.
And for them, in these extreme cases, the death penalty becomes a path to, and I'm quoting here, redemption.
Interesting. Interesting take.
Yeah, and this obviously ties into a much larger conversation about the very nature of justice,
For some.
punishment,
For sure.
and even forgiveness.
Absolutely.
So, listener, where do you stand on the death penalty debate?
Yeah. Is there ever a situation where you believe it's truly justified?
It's definitely a question that forces you to grapple with some uncomfortable truths.
For sure.
Now, what I found really interesting is how the author connects this idea of justified punishment
Okay.
to their broader discussion of authority.
Okay.
They argue that those in positions of power, because they represent a higher standard, should actually face harsher consequences for wrongdoing.
So it's not just about punishing evil acts.
Right.
It's about holding those who should be
Right.
above those acts
Exactly.
to an even higher level of accountability.
Precisely.
And this line of thinking leads them to explore this really thorny issue of when it might be justifiable to actively oppose
Yeah.
or even remove those in power.
Mm-hmm.
So they're really wrestling with this age-old question of when does simply enduring injustice become a form of complicity? Which brings us to this really crucial point in the article, where the author grapples with the distinction between passive resistance.
And active opposition.
Yeah.
Now, they don't lay out a clear-cut answer,
Okay.
but they do suggest that there's a sort of line in the sand.
Interesting.
And that line gets crossed when the state starts using its power to control people based on their inaction or their refusal to conform.
So it's not necessarily about what you do, but about being punished for what you don't do or believe.
Think about it, listener.
Hmm.
Can you think of any real-world examples, historical or current,
Yeah.
where governments have overstepped in this way, trying to control people through their inaction or beliefs?
Right.
How do people react?
Yeah, it's a question that has played out in countless ways throughout history.
Absolutely.
And the author seems to be suggesting that there's a tipping point,
Yeah.
a moment when simply enduring injustice becomes untenable.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets even more interesting. Despite all this talk of opposing authority, the author actually rejects the idea of revolution outright. They argue that true lasting change can't come from violent upheaval.
Interesting.
Instead, they advocate for respecting established systems and working within those frameworks to bring about change.
Okay.
It's a more patient,
So play the long game.
play the long game,
Yeah.
even when faced with what they see as urgent threats.
Right. And that raises a really tough question for me. Like, how patient can you really be when you genuinely believe society is heading down a dangerous path?
Yeah. That tension is at the heart of this article.
Yeah.
The author clearly feels this urgency, but they ultimately emphasize the importance of personal growth and setting a positive example. They seem to believe that by aligning their actions with their beliefs, they can inspire others to do the same.
So it's less about changing the system from the outside and more about changing hearts and minds from within.
Exactly. And they connect this back to the idea of Christianity's decline. Remember, they see that decline as a symptom of a larger societal problem.
Right.
They argue that the separation of church and state, which was originally intended to protect religion from political interference,
Right.
has actually backfired.
Oh, so instead of safeguarding religion, they're saying it's actually led to its weakening.
That's their argument.
Interesting.
They believe the state has used its power to secularize society and, in their view, diminish the influence of Christianity,
Right.
which they see as the only force truly capable of keeping society morally grounded.
It's a pretty provocative take on the whole separation of church and state debate.
Yeah, for sure.
They're essentially saying that the absence of religious influence in government has created a moral vacuum. And then they don't shy away from calling out what they see as hypocrisy within the Christian community itself.
Right.
They argue that many Christians are failing to actually live by the principles they claim to uphold. So it's not just a critique of secular society. It's also a critique of what they perceive as a diluted form of Christianity.
Right. A watered-down version.
Yeah, that's lost its way.
Yeah.
So for them, this internal struggle within Christianity becomes the most dangerous form of evil.
Yeah.
It's not just external forces we need to worry about, but the corruption of our values from within.
Right.
Which brings us to a really controversial part of the article.
Okay.
If revolution isn't the answer,
Yeah.
what does the author propose instead?
Well, they actually float the idea of fascism
Whoa.
in what they call its most idealized form
Okay.
as a potential short-term solution.
Now, that's going to raise some eyebrows.
Yeah.
It's not every day you hear someone suggesting fascism even as a temporary fix.
And it's important to be very clear here. They're not endorsing fascism
Right.
as we typically understand it, with its history of violence and oppression.
Of course.
They're specifically talking about a theoretical form of fascism,
Okay.
one focused on a return to traditional values and strong centralized leadership.
Yeah.
They see it as a potential reset button for society.
So a way to transition from what they see as a failing system to something they believe would be more stable
Right.
and aligned with their values.
Yes. But even then, they acknowledge the inherent risks.
Yeah.
They point out that fascist leaders, even with good intentions, often become corrupted by power and end up clinging to control,
Right.
which defeats the purpose of using it as a temporary measure.
Right. So it's a risky proposition, to say the least.
Yeah, definitely.
But if fascism is only a temporary
Mm-hmm.
and potentially dangerous fix,
Right.
what's the end goal here? What's
Yeah.
the ideal society they're ultimately striving for?
Well, the author seems to believe that the only lasting solution is a return to traditional values and a more spiritually grounded society.
Okay.
They argue that people need to rediscover the importance of faith, family, and community if they want to reverse what they see as a societal decline.
So it's a call for a pretty fundamental shift
Mhm.
in how we view the world and our place in it.
Yeah.
It's not just about tweaking the existing system.
Yeah.
It's about going back to what they consider to be foundational principles.
And they don't sugarcoat the challenges of making such a shift.
No.
They acknowledge that it would require a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths,
Right.
challenge prevailing narratives,
Mm-hmm.
and possibly even make significant sacrifices.
It's not a path for the faint of heart.
No.
But even if you disagree with their conclusions, They raise some really thought-provoking questions.
So absolutely.
We've covered a lot here, from the author's critique of modern society and their unconventional views on fascism to their emphasis on personal responsibility and living by your values.
Right.
And what really struck me was the author's sense of urgency, you know?
Yeah.
They seem to genuinely believe that time is running out for peaceful change.
Yes. And they use several recent events to illustrate this point. They specifically mention the COVID-19 pandemic and the rise of what they call technocratic elites. They see these events as part of a larger trend of eroding individual liberties and concentrating power.
Right.
In the hands of a select few, they paint a pretty bleak picture of where they think this is all heading.
It's almost like they're saying we're at a crossroads, right?
Right.
And the path we choose now will determine the fate of society. Which brings us back to that central question posed at the beginning.
Yeah.
Where do we go from here?
Well, the author doesn't provide a step-by-step plan.
Okay.
But they do suggest that the line between passive resistance and active opposition becomes increasingly blurred when the state starts overstepping its boundaries and infringing on individual rights.
So there's this idea that at some point, simply enduring injustice becomes a form of complicity.
Exactly.
But they also acknowledge the potential dangers of resorting to violence or revolution, especially given their earlier dismissal of those methods.
Right. It's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
And they even admit to feeling a sense of guilt and frustration over their own perceived inaction.
Yeah.
Despite their strong convictions.
Right.
You know, they seem to be wrestling with that tension between wanting to uphold their principles and fearing the potential consequences of taking a more active stance.
Which I think is a struggle a lot of people can relate to.
Oh, absolutely.
Particularly in times of social and political upheaval.
Yes.
How do we reconcile that desire for peace and stability with the need to stand up for what we believe in, especially when the stakes feel so high?
And that's where their final point becomes so crucial.
Okay.
They emphasize the importance of self-perfection, of striving to become a living example of the values we want to see in the world.
So it's not just about talking the talk.
Right.
It's about walking the walk.
Exactly.
Even when it's difficult.
Even when it's hard. And while that might seem like a small and insignificant act on its own, they seem to believe that it's the most powerful tool we have for creating lasting change. It's about planting seeds, inspiring others through our actions, and trusting that those seeds will eventually bear fruit.
It's a reminder that real change often starts at the individual level, and that even in the face of what might seem like overwhelming forces, we each have a role to play in shaping the future. But the author leaves us with one final, and I think quite provocative question.
Okay.
They seem to believe that time is running out for peaceful change.
Yes.
Listener, do you share that sense of urgency? And if so, where do we as individuals and as a society go from here?
It's a question worth pondering.
It is. Well, that brings us to the end of another deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.